Bayesian in Psychoaffective Disorders. The title of Andrea's presentation for today is Hierarchical Bayesian Inference Underpins Human Social Learning. Andrea, thanks again for accepting our invitation. We are so grateful to have you. The floor is yours. I just wanted to mention one thing, that Andrea is okay to answer questions during her slides. So feel free to interrupt. And yeah, that's it. Please go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation today. I will start the talk with kind of maybe a philosophical question, which is, are we able to have a complete mathematical understanding of how the brain works? And I will turn and I will kind of highlight the fact that fundamental mathematical formalisms are very common to certain disciplines, in particular, for example, in physics. And they've allowed a lot of progress in the discipline, in particular by allowing us to link seemingly unrelated observations, and they have helped us generate new hypotheses. For example, if you take the Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, they've allowed us to connect seemingly unrelated observations, such as related to electromagnetic fields and light. So my question is, do these sort of unifying mathematical formalisms have a place in the field of cognitive neuroscience? And in particular, can they help us understand complex human behavior? And going even further, can they help us understand maladaptive human behavior? Today, I will talk about dynamic hierarchical Bayesian inference underpinning human social learning. And this is the outline of my talk. And basically, I will propose a mathematical formalism that might allow us to capture human social learning and allow us to explain how it might be implemented in the brain and how it might, how that might go wrong in particular psychiatric disorders. So before I start my talk, I would like to thank my colleagues in Zurich and Basel in Switzerland. A lot of the work I will present today has been done in collaboration with the colleagues at the Translation Neuromodeling Unit under the supervision of Professor Klaas and Stefan. So today I will start by proposing that when it comes to the function of the human brain, one potential unifying mathematical formalism is Bayesian inference, or is related to the Bayes rule. So I will start with the theory of the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which proposes that the function of the brain is to make inferences about hidden states in the world and update those inferences via sensory inputs, incoming inputs, or consequences of those true hidden states. In other words, the function of the brain is to make predictions or hypotheses about these states and to continuously update those hypotheses via prediction errors or surprise signals, which reflect the difference between one's model of the world and the information that is processed through the sensory systems that is a consequence of our interaction with the outside world, with the environment. So at the heart of this formalism, of course, is the Bayes rule, which proposes that beliefs can be cast as probability distributions. And an expectation can be defined as a posterior predictive density one's expectations about states in the world under a certain model of the world changes as a function of one's prior beliefs. So in this case, these expectations are ongoing predictions that are also weighted against the likelihood, the probability of observing those sensory inputs under that model of the world. That is normalized by the model evidence. The model evidence also allows us to compare different mechanisms, different models about those hidden states. Now, let's propose that this is a hierarchical process. And the idea here is that this very simple Bayes rule can explain belief updates and learning processes at different hierarchies, and allow us to, in a way, infer on those true hidden states at multiple time points. And I will go into the specifics of this model a bit more, but when we think about learning per se and relate that to reinforcement learning theory, we have the proposal that beliefs change as a function of prediction errors, of course, but also as a function of an individual specific learning rate, which reflects the degree to which one updates their model of the world. Now, in this hierarchical formalism of Bayesian inference, we have something very similar where the degree, the belief update, or the degree to which we change our prediction about states in the world is dependent on the prediction error, but also by a ratio of precisions. In this case, the precision is related to uncertainty in the sense that it reflects the distribution, the variance of that belief. And the precision in this case is the inverse of the variance. So this theory proposes that in the numerator, we have the sensory precision from lower level states that functions to augment the impact that prediction errors have on our model of the world. They increase the impact of that prediction error. You can think of sensory precision as specifically related to the sensory input, but it could also be related to the frequency of occurrence of that sensory input. And now on the denominator, we have the belief precision, which functions to dampen the impact that prediction errors have on our model of the world. We can think of belief precision as the level of confidence that we have that our model of the world is the correct one. You can think of this dichotomy between sensory precision and belief precision as analogous to what I'm learning now versus what I already know. So what I'm learning now, that sensory precision, impacts the degree to which we react to that new prediction error and use it to update our beliefs. Whereas the belief precision, what I already know, allows us to disregard prediction errors that just reflect stochastic fluctuations in the environment that do not necessitate learning or behavioral adaptation. So how is this expressed mathematically? So the idea is in a way quite simple. This is on the left-hand side, the graphical representation of the model. But essentially what the model proposes is a set of hierarchically coupled Gaussian states that evolve in time as Gaussian random walks. And what they reflect is two main things. So the association between two events that are observed, cue outcome associations, as in reinforcement learning, as well as the rate of change or the volatility of those associations. And they are coupled in very specific ways, such that the variance of the state at the lower level, x2, depends on the mean at the level above, at x3. In other words, the mean of the volatility, or how quickly these associations change in time, determines the variance of that distribution about the association of those two events. Now, this filter is, in a sense, can be increased ad infinitum. So we could have a rate of change about the rate of change, for example, driving the variance of x3. But in this case, in our applications to explain simple human behavior, we have a fixed parameter here, theta, that determines the step size of that update. It's called, you can call it the meta volatility, and it determines how quickly this state evolves in time. Whereas in x2 here, that's dependent on the level above. We also have two additional parameters that determine the evolution of x2. The first one is related or acts to amplify or reduce the impact that x3 has on x2. It's the coupling parameter. So the higher it is, the more influence changes in volatility have on that association strength at the level below. And if this parameter was very low, then that would assume kind of a disconnected model, a non-hierarchical model. Now, what it turns out is that this parameter kappa impacts the phasic component of the learning rate about the association strength, which has very interesting implications in neuroscience. Now, omega is another parameter that determines the dynamics of this state, and this is sort of the baseline of this log volatility. You can think of it as the tonic component of the learning rate is that degree of belief update that doesn't change as a function of the volatility. So it's sort of a subject-specific degree of belief update. So how quickly someone changes their beliefs according to new incoming prediction errors. And these are the states basically that determine the probability of certain events in the world and of course cause the sensory inputs that the agent observes. Now, if we take a very simple scenario, so for example, the dark room scenario, imagine the agent is locked in a dark room and they observe a flickering, on and off flickering of the light. And the goal is to predict the probability of light and the probability of darkness to be able to escape the dark room. So at the beginning, the agent observes sort of a stochastic process. The probability of light going on is 50%. And you see that the agent predicts this probability. Now there is a change in that probability around trial 100, where light is predominantly on, then light is predominantly off, and light is predominantly on and off and so on. So you have these kind of rapid changes in the context, and i.e. an increase in that volatility of the association. Now, in the second, in the third part of this experiment, you have the same setting essentially with a stochastic event. So the probability of light going on is 50%. And what you see is that you see the impact of that volatility. You see that there is an increase according to the model. The model would predict that there is an increase in that learning rate in the belief update. So here, the person, the agent, one would assume, is learning much faster and reacting to incoming prediction errors much more in order to learn, because they are expecting an increase in volatility based on the past. So what one would take from this is that the belief precision here in the denominator, that changes as a function of this estimated volatility. So when the estimated volatility is high, then that precision is low, which means that one becomes more uncertain about their model of the world, and therefore uses these new incoming prediction errors to learn. And in this way, this can be thought of as a generalized case of a RL rule in reinforcement learning, an update rule, where instead of having a fixed learning rate, the learning rate is dynamic and is adapting to changes in the environmental context due to the hierarchical nature of the model. Now, what is in these three states? What is the generative model exactly?
Andreea, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry. There are a few questions. So I asked my question first. So what are the green dots in the?
I'm sorry. Yeah, so the green dots are just the input that the agent observes. When the dot is the green dot is at 1, it reflects a light going on event, and when the green dot is 0, it reflects light going off.
Okay.
So you can think of it as in another sense of learning, it's the congruency. If you think of it as an association that the agent is learning, is the congruency between the cue and the outcome. But in this case, in this very simple case, it's just light on or light off.
Okay. Okay. That's perfect. So we have Anna raised hand. Anna, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So I have a question. At the beginning, before you started talking about the volatility and association, you mentioned that you have a random walk model. And
yeah. Gaussian random walk, yeah.
Right. So how do you, if you have a random walk, why would you have some other associated like probability distribution other than a Gaussian? I'm not sure. Or do you have a random walk that's weighted in some way?
So it's all Gaussian distributions, basically. So X2 and X3 are Gaussian distributions. And this is how they're formalized. So the probability of X3 at the current time point K is normally distributed around X3 at K-1, the previous time point. And in this case, the meta volatility parameter that determines the dispersion of the distribution. And then for X2, which you can think of it, the association strength or the tendency towards category 1, such as in this case, the light, the tendency towards lightness, is the probability of x2 at time point k that depends on the value at the previous time point, and the variance is the exponential of kappa times x3 at k-1 at the previous time point plus omega. So here, the estimated volatility from the previous time point determines this dispersion of the distribution. Now, to make it to turn it into a probability, so to have a Bernoulli distribution, we perform a sigmoid transformation of x2, but that's just that's not Markov process. That's directly determined by the value of x2 at that time point.
I also have a question with the light experiment, with the agent. So you have the states either 0 or 1 representing light on or off. What does it mean to have the agent give you like a 0.5 or like a 0.75 or something like that? Is that are they expressing their confidence in that number?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a strange experiment, but think about so obviously in this case the agent is making some predictions. Let's imagine in this experiment they have a lever that they can flip up or down to indicate their prediction. So of course you would assume that the agent is actually making some behavioral prediction, categorical prediction about the light being on or off at the next time point.
So
does that make sense?
Right.
So
but
if
you have like lever
confidence, it's the decision.
Right, but if you have lever on or off, wouldn't that represent 1 or 0? Like, because you can see that like at time point like between 0 and 100, there's a much smaller variance in the numbers than between 250 and 300. And I'm wondering how you get that from the experiment.
Yeah, so they make a categorical decision. And what we're doing here is that we're mapping a probability, an inferred probability, to a categorical decision, a probability of a categorical decision, and both are between 0 and 1. And we use a sigmoidal function to map these two probabilities, the probability of the stimulus category of light on or off, and the probability of deciding to flip the lever up to predict that light is on, or to flip it down to predict that light is off. And now what we estimate there is just the slope of that sigmoid. So we call it the decision temperature, which reflects how much people act according to their predictions.
Thank you.
Sorry, Andrea. So we have one more from Alexandra.
Yeah.
But before Alexandra starting, I just want to mention, because we interrupt you in general, I think that if the questions are short, please do that. Otherwise, we can do a discussion after 11:30, which is the official time of the talk. Okay, so we want the talk be done by 11:30, and then we can also have time to ask questions. Okay. Having said that, please, Alexandra, if you want.
Okay, yeah, we can ask later. No problem.
Okay. Okay. So you can continue, I think, Andrea.
Okay. Great. Now this is the generative process of the input that the subject observes. Now, what we're interested in as the experimenter, we are interested in how the agent is learning about the input, how they're approximating that true hidden state that us as the experimenter have access to. Now, by performing a variational approximation on these hierarchically coupled states, one can obtain update equations that describe or propose a process of belief updating that we assume the agent is undergoing. And this starts sort of, and these hierarchical equations start with a simple prediction error at the lowest level, which we could call the outcome prediction error, which is essentially the discrepancy between the input that the agent observes and their prediction of the probability that mu1 hat at time point k, which is the sigmoid of mu2 at k minus 1. And that is a logistic sigmoid function. Now, at the same level, we have an accompanying precision, outcome precision that can be computed, which is equated as, which is the predicted precision plus the variance of the Bernoulli distribution. So we have basically two quantities that we can compute based on the observation of the input. Now, what enters the belief update at the second level, which is the tendency of lightness versus darkness, are these two factors, the precision and the prediction error about the outcome. Now, the computation of these two are necessary for the computation of the next higher level states, which are the volatility prediction error. Now, the volatility prediction error is a sign prediction error, and it indicates whether the environmental context of the learning was more volatile or more stable than predicted. So a positive value would indicate that the environment had been more volatile than the agent predicted, whereas a negative value reflects that it was more stable than predicted. Now, associated with that volatility prediction error is the volatility precision, which in itself is a function of that volatility prediction error. So essentially, you have a kind of a mathematical, a prescribed mathematical hierarchy for these update equations, starting from the lower level to higher levels. So these two, the volatility precision and the volatility prediction error, enter the belief update about volatility. And this could kind of continue to higher levels if we had a deeper filter, hierarchical Gaussian filter in this case. Now, the question that we asked is whether this mathematical formalism could be used to explain more complex human behavior, such as in the case of social learning or learning about intentions. And the reason that I became particularly interested in social cognition is that I was very interested in understanding how delusions or paranoid beliefs are formed and how they might emerge because of my interest in psychiatry and in particular in psychosis and schizophrenia. So we wanted to devise a task that allowed us to capture aberrant beliefs about others' intentions. So we first introduced this task in a interactive setting, which I will explain, and then we extended that further and further afterwards. So in this interactive setting, we had two participants that were randomly assigned to an advisor or player role. Now, they met for the first time at the experiment, and they sat in front of each other and were presented with the task on the computer screen, but had separate screens so that they would see different aspects of the task of this sort of interactive game. So now let me take you through the game because I think it's very important to understand how we laid it out, and then how we modeled behavior from this game. So put yourselves into the shoes of the player. Imagine that you were assigned the player role. Now you receive you're now interacting with the advisor, and you receive the task on your own separate screen, which is the following. You're told that this is a binary lottery task for which you have to make as many correct predictions as possible. And with every correct prediction, your progress at the bottom of the screen will increase. If you predict incorrectly, the progress will decrease. Now, your goal is to reach the silver or the gold target, which means you want to accumulate as many points as possible to receive either to receive monetary rewards. The maximum value would be the gold, and 50% of that value would be silver. And that's 20 francs, which is about 35 Canadian dollars. Now, you are shown a binary lottery. It's an explicit probability in the form of a pie chart, and you have to predict which, if you're sampling from that lottery, which color would win. Is it blue or is it green? So you have to make a decision. This is like pushing that lever up or down. Your decision is blue, green. But in addition to the binary lottery, the person sitting in front of you will provide you with a recommendation about which option to choose by holding up a card, either a green card or a blue card. Now, this person who's sitting in front of you, you're told, is getting additional information about the outcome of that lottery. So that outcome has been sampled from the original probability, and the person in front of you is given a hint about an additional hint about what that outcome is going to be. Now, what's important here is that you know as the player that the person in front of you, the advisor, doesn't have full information about the outcome, so that they can be wrong in giving the advice. But at the same time, they have their own incentive structure in the background, which might motivate them to not always provide you with the best of advice. In fact, they might be motivated to trick you so that they gain points during the game. So in every trial, you have to decide, how much do I trust the advisor's recommendation against that existing probability? And in the game, you're always displayed what the actual outcome is. And based on that outcome, you have to update your beliefs about the advisor's fidelity. And that will impact how much you trust their recommendation. So this is what the player sees. Now, what about the advisor? Imagine that you are given the role of the advisor. What do you see as the advisor? Well, as the advisor, you get to see the player's progress and how that changes from trial to trial. You see the player's goals, the silver and gold. But you are given your own incentive structure, the gold and the silver range. And you're told basically that if you can get the player's progress to land either in the gold range or the silver range, you as the advisor would get a reward. The maximum reward for gold and 50% of that for silver. However, if the player's progress lands anywhere outside those ranges, you don't get any points. In other words, we create a situation where at the beginning of the game, the goals of the player and the advisor are congruent in that they both want the progress to advance. And then once they approach the gold range, then this competition starts. So the advisor is sort of motivated, incentivized in this case, to provide incorrect advice on purpose to keep the player's progress at bay. Now, of course, you assume that the player figures this out, and then the progress surpasses the gold range. What happens there is that, again, they start a phase of congruent goals, which means that the advisor will be incentivized to provide helpful advice again. And then we can also see how much the player decides to trust the advisor in that context when the intentions changed, when the player experienced volatility. But what does the advisor actually get? What is the hint? Well, the advisor gets another pie chart. In this case, it's 80% probability and it's constant. So that means that the advisor has more information than the player all the time, but it's only 80%. So there is still a degree of uncertainty. In other words, the advisor could intentionally have provided incorrect advice, but ends up giving good advice, or vice versa, intentionally had wanted to provide helpful advice, but mistakenly gives incorrect advice. And what we did in this interaction, so we had about 20 people interact this way, and we selected the dominant strategy that essentially most advisors employed, which was very much in line with this incentive structure. And we took the videos. So I didn't mention that, but the advisor and the advisor's suggestions were videotaped with the subject's consent. And after the study, we extracted the videos from these advisors that used the dominant strategy. We cut them, edited them in 2-second video clips so that to create essentially a setting of that matched that dominant strategy that we can then display in a structured experiment in a different group of participants that were also taking the player role. So the reason for that is that, of course, ultimately we want to be able to compare participants' behavior, the level of trust and distrust of the advisor in this setting. And to do that, we have to provide the same input structure. Otherwise, the parameters, their learning parameters, would differ just because they were presented to a different, they were paired with a different type of advisor. So in order to compare these learning strategies, we needed to match the inputs. And that was the reason for including the video clips. Now, what is happening in this game and how did we go about modeling it? So we assume that the player is observing the advice and the outcome of the lottery, and the input is essentially the congruency between both, one being that the advice is correct and 0, the advice is incorrect. And we assume that the player is tracking 2 quantities that change in time, and and the first one is the advice validity, which is in a sense the fidelity of the advisor, how helpful or how misleading they are. But at the same time, they are tracking the volatility or the rate of change of that validity. You can think of it as the validity being sort of the velocity or the speed, and the advisor volatility being the acceleration. So the idea is that people the assumption is that people are tracking these 2 quantities over time, such that when they experience the advisor as volatile, then they would rather rely on the binary lottery and update their beliefs more quickly about the advisor, until they figure out whether they are helpful but just made a mistake, or whether they are truly misleading. So we used the approach, the observing the observer approach. So similarly to how I explained the model, so from observing the player's response to either take the advice or disregard it or go against the advice, we infer on the states and the parameters of this process from subjects' trial by trial decisions. And so we extended this interactive game to another experimental setting where, as I said, instead of having another agent provide advice, we had video clips, pre-recorded video clips that were taken from phases when the advisor was truly helpful and phases when the advisor was truly misleading. And we had several variations of this task. So we also investigated the degree of advice taking when individuals are not given an explicit probability about the lottery, but in fact, they have to infer it by actually sampling the card outcomes. So in that sense, they learn both about the probability of the rewarding outcome being the green or the blue card, as well as the probability of the advice accuracy. And then we also extended the paradigm to include implicit advice giving. So just through changes in gaze direction and more recently, changes in gesturing, like pointing, to look at how people learn about and integrate implicit advice in this type of probabilistic learning task. Now, the model evidence of this process allows us to compare different hypothesized models of how people might be learning in this task. So for instance, we can propose that people are either using, this 3-level hierarchical Gaussian filter model, or rather they might be using a normative model, which means that they're not differing in their learning process, but rather in their decision, whether they go with the advice or disregard it. We also hypothesized a non-hierarchical process of learning. So that means that the agents are not tracking the volatility of the advice accuracy, but just learning about the advice accuracy and updating that with a constant learning rate. Because we have this model evidence that we can approximate, we can also compare models in terms of their model evidences. And throughout these different combinations of non-social cue and advice, we found that the model that explained behavior best is the 3-level hierarchical Gaussian filter model that assumed that in the decision-making process, people arbitrate, which means that they take into account both the advice and the non-social information or the self-sampled outcomes. So they're not relying on one or the other, they're always relying on a combination of the two. And we can also capture in our model how much they rely on one compared to the other and look at that individual difference in that as well. So this is the model. Are there, applied to this specific task, are there any questions so far?
Sorry, can I ask you a quick question, Andrea?
Yeah.
So you said the best outcome is a combination, meaning that people tend to take the advice some of the times, right? Is
exactly.
That okay?
Yeah, and this is actually very interesting because this this differs with certain personality traits. It also differs with self-report. So, for instance, in this 2014 paper, we found that the degree to which people took the advice into account predicted their scores on an interpersonal reactivity index. So people that reported to be very good perspective takers using theory of mind to make sense of other intentions, of others' intentions, were also more likely to rely on the advice compared to the non-social cue. But it's never absolutely one or absolutely the other. It's always a combination of the two.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I went a bit far here. Now, the next question we had is basically, does the brain implement this learning process that we propose here? So the next step was to have participants play the game, the task, using video clips, this time in combination with fMRI recordings or with electrophysiological recordings. So I'm going to speak about a few fMRI studies that we conducted in Zurich. But first, I want to highlight the analysis methodology. So how do we actually investigate whether the brain is implementing this learning process? So the way we did this is actually quite simple, straightforward. In doing neuroimaging research, we're all using this model, which is essentially the general linear model. So we want to explain voxel time series as a function of some model time series. Usually we propose if we propose a block design, our modeled time series would be stimulus on or off. But in this case, what we're doing is we're using, as the modeled time series, we're using the subject-specific prediction errors and precisions that we extracted from the winning model for that specific individual. So in other words, we are designing GLMs that are participant-specific because they reflect their own unique prediction error or precision signatures that were extracted from the winning model that was fit to their behavior. So some people call it model-based fMRI approach. It has been used actually for at least a decade. And essentially, it allows us to address the question, are there voxels in the brain that for which both fluctuations, for which the both signal fluctuates as a function of these sort of prediction errors or precisions as a function of these model time series. So we can obtain these statistical parametric maps, and we used also SPM to analyze the data that tells us basically what brain regions are covariant with these quantities. And of course, we don't orthogonalize these regressors because we want to look at the unique contribution of each of these regressors on the voxel time series. And what is important here is that you have, because there is a potential collinearity of those regressors, that one designs experiments with maximum decorrelation between those prediction error trajectories. So that becomes an important component of the experimental design. Now, this is the analysis methodology, and we, in a previous paper, we basically ran this experiment that integrated the binary lottery, the explicit lottery, and the advice with fMRI. So we had kind of two different experiments that were performed on different subject groups and also different scanners, actually, just due to availability. But essentially what we found was that there are certain regions of the brain that seem to correlate specifically to these different hierarchically coupled precision weighted prediction errors. So when we go now to the bottom of the hierarchy, the outcome prediction error and its precision, what we find is that a region of the midbrain showed particularly strong correlation with these precision weighted outcome prediction errors. And this is what was a region that we found in these two separate studies, but also when we performed a logical and conjunction analysis, we found that there were a group of voxels that consistently represented this quantity across these two studies. So, of course, we also obtained cortical activations that that were consistent across studies. And what was interesting is that we found a lot of areas that have been reported in social cognition neuroscience studies, and I will go through these in a moment. But what about the higher level precision weighted prediction errors that update beliefs about volatility? Well, we found a small region of the basal forebrain that was consistent across the studies. I mean, the effect was much smaller than in the outcome prediction error. That could be partly also because there was less consistency between the two studies, which is partly due to the fact that the volatility structure, the input structure of the task varied from one study to the other. But we did find that this region covaried with this volatility precision weighted prediction error, and suggesting that perhaps we have this dissociation between low and high precision weighted prediction error and dopaminergic and cholinergic systems that would support this theory that while dopamine signals trial by trial precision error prediction error learning, acetylcholine is tracking the changes in the probabilistic association between events. This was also reproduced in other associative learning studies. In Iglesias et al., they found this dissociation between dopamine and acetylcholinergic regions for the low versus high-level precision-weighted prediction errors in a sensory learning task. It was also reproduced recently in a separate study, and we also found the same dissociation in another recent study that used a different social learning paradigm. Now, what about the setting in which people not only have to learn about the advice fidelity, or they don't have to learn about a single association strength, but now two of them at the same time? So this kind of reproduces this sort of investment scenario, which is basically, if you have two sources of information, one is your own statistical learning about the environment, your tracking of rewarding outcomes. That's this non-social prediction on the left, on the right. And in addition to that, you have an advisor, like an investment advisor, that gives you input about what stocks, what outcomes you should invest in or not. So the dilemma here is to weight your direct sampling of the environment against someone else's perspective or someone else's input. And essentially that means that you're tracking two quantities at the same time. And on every trial, you are arbitrating, which means that you are deciding how much do I rely on the advice compared to the non-social information. So we had a task where we had the advisor and the non-social information that was the individual's own sampling of rewarding outcomes, that we presented in a factorial fashion where both of them were stable and reliable in one phase. Both of them were unreliable and volatile in the other phase. And then we had two separate phases where one was more stable than the other. That allows us to basically understand how people learn and decide as a function of their perceived reliability of each information channel, and try to figure out if there is something special about the social input. So do people in general trust or rely or arbitrate in favor of the social agent of the advisor rather than their own sampling of the environmental statistics. And one thing that we found basically was that if you looked at the these lower level precision weighted prediction errors, we essentially looked at these two sets of precision weighted prediction errors independently. So we had the precision weighted prediction error that updated beliefs about probabilistic outcomes. That's individuals' own direct experience of the environmental statistics, against the precision weighted prediction error about the advisor's fidelity, how much people perceive the advisor's trustworthiness. And now, so the activations in green reflect the subcortical and cortical representations of that advice-related precision weighted prediction error. And in blue, we have the precision weighted prediction error about the card outcomes. So what we found was interesting. We found, of course, some overlapping regions in the sensory cortices, in the visual cortex. This is all presented, the outcome is presented visually, so that makes sense. Then we see an overlapping representation in the insula, for example, that has been involved in this precision weighted prediction error learning. And then we find some distinct representations, for example, for the advice-related prediction error. We find some effects in sort of mentalizing regions like the posterior superior temporal sulcus and the anterior temporal parietal junction. But what I want to draw your attention to is that if we look at the midbrain effect again, we see that this sort of outcome-related prediction error about the advice and about the card outcomes are both represented in a region of the dopaminergic midbrain. And the yellow here is a mask that we used. So while we find these effects after performing whole brain correction, if we look at specific neuromodulatory system masks, if we look inside the masks, we also see an effect of these two precision weighted outcome prediction errors in the dopaminergic midbrain that sort of reproduces these previous results that we found in a different task. Now, what about the volatility precision weighted prediction error? So we did pretty much exactly the same analysis, but now for the volatility precision weighted prediction error. So all of these regressors are included in the same general linear model. And now we are looking at the effect of those two regressors for the card and for the advice. Again, the volatility precision weighted prediction errors. We see very different cortical representations of those two. And now when we look in the mask for the cholinergic system, well, for the neuromodulatory system, we see one effect of the advice volatility precision weighted prediction error, but this time in the brainstem cholinergic nuclei. So it may be based on this evidence from these group of studies that potentially different neuromodulatory systems may track these distinct learning currencies. So learning about the outcome versus learning about the volatility of that association strength. And this is particularly interesting in applications to clinical populations because, for example, we know that in schizophrenia, we have impairments in both dopaminergic and cholinergic systems, and we have medication that targets dopaminergic versus cholinergic systems. So it is a method, a way of understanding the nature of the dysfunction that is related to predicting others' intentions, that is related to persecutory ideation, that is a very common symptom of psychosis. Now, as I mentioned, we also perform the task in combination with electrophysiological recordings. So participants were there in the scanner, but we also performed a large EEG study that looked at the representation of these quantities in time rather than in space. So in order to perform source reconstruction, we did essentially the same study with fMRI to find sort of the spatial or neural correlates of these learning quantities. And now basically we can, based on the task, we can place on a hierarchy several different quantities that might play a key role in the trial by trial belief updates. So at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have prediction errors related to the cue, the pie chart itself, the advice and the advice prediction error, the outcome prediction error given the combination of the cue and the probability of the advice precision, the volatility precision, and the volatility prediction error and the volatility precision. So we have these 6 computational quantities that we can hypothesize that would be critical for learning in this particular task. And these are the trajectories for one representative subject that were extracted from the winning model. So we have the cue-related prediction errors, advice prediction error, and so forth, the temporal dynamics of these quantities. And we can look at what regions of the brain, similarly to before, are co-active or representing these modeled trajectories. And what is interesting about this is for people that are interested in social cognition is that for the volatility precision, we see a lot of the areas that have been associated with mentalizing functions, such as the middle dorsal cingulate gyrus, the anterior TPJ. It's noteworthy to look at that. And what is also interesting is that for the volatility prediction error, one cortical region that seems to show up often when looking at the volatility prediction error about the advisor's fidelity is the dorsal ACC. Now, for the other outcome prediction errors, we see sort of the typical striatum medial prefrontal cortex activation that has been reported in other studies that used reward learning based on probabilistic input structures. And now we essentially use these fMRI results for us to perform a future source reconstruction of our EEG data, which actually I don't have time to go into today, but we can discuss it after 11:30, and I could show you those results as well. But now we're just looking in sensor space. So this is not a fancy analysis by all means. In fact, it's using the same type of GLM as we used in the fMRI analysis, the same type of general linear model. But now what we're doing is the XYZ coordinate for the EEG data represents peristimulus time. So what we've done is we've pre-processed and epoch'd the data given the onset of the outcome where we hypothesize that we see these belief updating processes unfold. And essentially, we perform a trial by trial analysis. So we're not averaging the epochs, we're not computing event-related potentials, but we're looking at how the amplitude, trial by trial amplitude, is modulated by these model time series. So it essentially measures the extent to which amplitude deflections shift in accordance to the magnitude of each of those regressors. So we can obtain a statistical parametric map just like we did in fMRI, but now we obtain it within volume. So we have XY 2D coordinate system that is just the scalp location, and the Z reflects the time point. So we can think about these 3D voxels in space, so expressed across channels, and in time, given the peristimulus time. And we essentially use exactly the same statistical machinery as we do for fMRI. So the key factor here is that we convert these trial by trial epoch data into images and are able to apply the same statistical machinery in random field theory and so on that we had applied for fMRI, but now for EEG. And this is what we find. So we're currently trying to try to see if we can replicate these results because they seem to be, very specific, and we want to make sure that it's not just specific to this sample and this study. But essentially, if you remember from the previous graph here, the mathematics proposes a certain computational hierarchy, mathematical hierarchy. And quantities 1 through 4 should be actually represented at the same time. They're all lower level quantities. But 5 and 6 should occur sequentially after 4. So after 4, we have 5 and then 6, because we need to compute, in order to compute the volatility related quantities, we need to compute the quantities at the level below. So we have a very specific temporal order with which we assume that these computations unfold. Oops, I gave away the result there. So we looked at, like I said, we put all of these regressors in a general linear model, and we performed F-tests for each regressor of that general linear model, which means that we look at both positive and negative deflections, so regions that correlate either positively or negatively with these amplitude fluctuations. Regions, by regions, I mean across the scalp and within time. So we found that the earliest, that the Q-related prediction error was represented earliest in time, starting with 100 milliseconds and peaking at 134 milliseconds. And then we had the prediction error. Then we had the outcome prediction error. Then the advice precision, the volatility prediction error. And finally, the last quantity was the volatility precision. And now we also looked at the extent of that cluster. So we wanted to make sure that the earliest time point where we see an effect of, for example, volatility precision, that the earliest time point does not precede the initial time point of the quantity before that, so that it's strictly sequential. And this is what we seem to find for this specific data set. But again, we have to reproduce it to make sure that this is consistent across different groups, but also to examine whether this is this is something specific to the type of task, or if it's something that is task independent. In other tasks where we use perceptual learnings, like in the mismatch negativity, for example, we also see this early effect of the low-level prediction error and the later effect of the high-level prediction error. But there we have just two quantities, so the probability of this sequence is higher. In this case, we have all these different quantities that we propose would show would be involved in the belief update, and we see the sequence. So by having sort of these multimodal neuroimaging effects, we can now propose a cognitive network model that that reflects essentially how this precision-weighted prediction error belief update that is expressed by the equation, how that might be represented in the cortex. So essentially, how this information is relayed from lower to higher level cortical areas, and what the distinct role of the prediction error and the precision is at these different levels of the hierarchy. So by being able to construct a cognitive network model, we have a more fine-grained assessment of that representation, of that learning process. And that's the next step in our analyses. Now, the applications to psychosis are particularly interesting, especially when we think about this ratio of precisions, the sensory precision compared to the belief precision. And this is because psychosis is a very interesting, follows a very interesting trajectory in the sense of the early stages when an individual is at risk of developing psychosis, or the prodromal phases, are associated with an enhanced perception of the world. People report that their senses are sharpened, sights and sounds possess a keenness that they've never experienced before. And this early phase of psychosis has been associated with aberrant prediction error learning, enhanced prediction error learning. Under this formalism, we can posit that in the early phase of psychosis, we see an overly high sensory precision of incoming prediction errors. That could be due to two things. That could be due to the fact that that precision is abnormal in itself, or it could be due to the fact that the belief precision in the denominator is too low, which leads to the model becoming too brittle and over-learning the environmental statistics. But now in the later phases, where, for example, positive symptoms such as delusions or delusional conviction is present, we can propose that now that weighting, that ratio has shifted to place an individual at a different extreme of the learning process, which is too low of a learning rate. In other words, people that report, I had to make any sense out of these uncanny coincidences, and I did it by drastically changing my perception of reality. People that report experiencing delusions about states in the world, that what those beliefs might reflect is an overly confident model of the world that leads to reduced learning and reduced learning about volatility, which means a reduced adaptation of the learning process. So this is entirely a simulation, but basically what you find is that in the cases with the reduced learning, you see that individual cannot infer on the true statistics of the environment and is essentially sticking to their prior beliefs. Now, we tested this in two populations. So one was individuals that were clinical high risk for psychosis in a small sample initially, and now in another sample in Basel. And basically what we find is that the learning process, this enhanced learning rate or enhanced precision weighted prediction error updating process, can be explained by a reduction in that higher level belief precision, the precision in the denominator, which essentially means that whenever we introduce a reversal or a change in environmental context, that's experienced by clinical high risk participants as extremely volatile. So the jump in volatility is much higher for the clinical high risk compared to the controls, and that stays high essentially, irrespective of increases in volatility. But now on the opposite side of the spectrum, if now in this study, we recruited a large number of participants that essentially were evaluated based on their degree of paranoia. So these were people from the general population, not patients, but they basically reported when we evaluated, then they reported extremely high or extremely low levels of paranoia. So we invited people from these two extremes when it came to persecutory ideation or paranoid beliefs about others. And what we found essentially was that in the people that had strong paranoid beliefs, we found this increased precision of top-down precision, this increased precision in the denominator, meaning that they were more likely to stick to their original beliefs that reflected a distrust of others, and thus did not learn or react to changes in the environment. So just to conclude the talk, this evidence suggests that there might be a useful mathematical formalism for that might help us to understand the mechanisms underlying human behavior in different contexts, albeit very specific contexts, very simple contexts, but that also might allow us to make inferences about the functions of neuromodulatory systems, dopamine, acetylcholine, noradrenaline. In other words, if we could place an equation for each of these different neuromodulatory systems, it would allow us to devise much more specific hypotheses. We can test them in pharmacological studies by specifically asking whether that neuromodulatory system is actually signaling that part of the model that we hypothesize it would be signaling. So is it the volatility precision that is signaled by the noradrenergic system, or is it the volatility prediction error? We can be much more specific about the function of those highly interacting systems. So thank you very much. This is the end of my talk, and let's open it up for discussion or questions.
Okay, that's perfect. I can just say that it was really, really amazing talk, and I'm happy that we could record actually so your talk and then come back to your slide again. So just before starting the question and answer again, although 11:30 is the official end time, but we stay here and for more question, answer, and discussion with Andrea. Okay, so please, if you have any question, you're going to start. I think I see one question in the chat. Yeah.
I could start.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Thanks for the really rich talk, Andrea. It was a lot of information. So I would like to start from the beginning. I was first wondering, when you created your model, why you used the specific hierarchy. So why was volatility association, events in the world? And I want to make sure that I've understood these terms correctly as well. So volatility and association, volatility in the flickering example that you showed is the flickering, the change in the on and off state of the light. Mm-hmm. But what are the events in the world, for example, would be random events unassociated with the flickering?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So I can maybe start with the first part, which is why this model of volatility dependent learning. Well, actually, that comes from the reinforcement learning theory and literature. And this sort of update rule, the prediction error functioning to update beliefs, that has been sort of the tenet of reinforcement learning theory. But now, sort of this is an extension of that is based on experiments, both in rats and in humans, that show that it's very likely that people are tracking something more than reward associations. So for instance, if you take experiments in rats where they have to select option A versus option B and then poke, that's their behavioral readout. What you see, if you have a probabilistic association, let's say 80% of the time A is rewarding and 20% of the time B, and vice versa, that even when the animal learns that association, they are engaging in this exploratory behavior as well, which is checking B, even though B is not associated with a reward. Mm-hmm. And this volatility learning has been hypothesized as a mechanism for exploratory behavior, for sort of foraging behavior. The idea that we're maximizing knowledge or epistemic value by changing the way we make associations, or, by changing our behavior and updating the association strength, but that also comes to the assumption that the environment is not always constant. That just because there was reward in option A doesn't mean that with time that might change due to weather, due to climate, and so on. That option B now becomes more rewarding. So that allows for adaptation, and that also reflects sort of it's like a resonance to the environment. It reflects the statistics of the environment that are not constant, that are changing. And the way you can think of it, so in the light example, you can think of it as obviously the experimenter, let's say, is controlling the switch. So you can think of it, the light or on or off is like a Morse code, that a pattern that a person has to learn in order to predict the light or dark, and in which context that probability is more likely or not. You can think of it as also just the natural rhythms of lightness and darkness that we are exposed to and that we learn very quickly. And even when we move to different parts of the world that have a distinct cycle like that. So so that's sort of the analogy. But when it comes to this association learning, it's the idea that the context can change. So in kind of a real world experiment, you can think of it as unexpected events that make the world more unpredictable. And it's the idea that if the brain is tracking volatility, then that means that we can adapt very quickly to large changes in the environment. Like, for instance, with the pandemic. To be able to adapt to that volatility means that we can adjust how we learn and how we sample the environment, given abrupt changes that we've never experienced before, that we didn't have to deal with before. So, but the beauty of this formalism is also that you can put in the reinforcement learning, that delta rule, as a special case of this more general learning process. You can say that when the environment is extremely stable, such as in a controlled experiment, for instance, that volatility at some point does not play a role in the learning process and is just constant, so that you have a low kappa, low theta, and only omega, which is just the constant learning rate, that plays a role in the belief updating process.
Can you explain for me, please, why it is the volatility that goes first, and that fits into the association, and then that fits into the events in the world, because that plays a role in how you set up the equations and how the probabilistic models compute parameters that then fit into the next distribution and then to the next distribution. So this particular hierarchy matters. And
Yeah.
I don't understand why these steps are in this specific sequence.
Yeah, so basically the sequence, so this is a bidirectional type of model. So the first, you're interpreting the input as a prediction error, as an outcome prediction error. And that input essentially updates the belief about the outcome. And that prediction error and precision about the outcome then feeds into the predictions about volatility. So the input is driving the estimation of volatility in the first direction. So at first, the input induces this bottom-up cascade of updates. If the input is constant, then the update about the volatility is that nothing has changed. Volatility prediction error is negative. The environment is stable. Now, there is the top-down impact for the next trial to compute the expectation. And that has to do with the fact that these levels are coupled through this variance expression here. So the variance of the level below is a function of the mean at the level above. So if the prediction is that the world is more stable than predicted, than expected, then that feeds into the level below, meaning that it reduces the variance or increases the precision of that prediction, of the expected prediction, leading to a reduced learning rate or a reduced belief update. This in itself is dependent on these subject-specific parameters. And that essentially the top-down effect is utilized to generate the next expectation, which is then again updated bottom-up through the input.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions, but I'll ask in the end.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Alessandra. Any more questions?
I have a question, if I can.
Sure.
Sure. Okay, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you very much for this nice talk. I have two questions. One just about the structure, the math structure of the model. And I'll start with that one. This two pathway you just described prevents the whole model, I guess, from diffusing out too far, right? Because these are just random walks and they should have a variance that just increases with time. So as I understand it, that the sigmoid function kind of prevents things from drifting too far, but also the fact that the output feeds back and comes back. So how do you get this to not just spread all over the place? Because these are Brownian motions; they're going to go all over the place, right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, first of all, as you intuited, this model is dependent on the input. So if in the absence of input, then the variance just the uncertainty increases. The way so first there is a sort of regularization through the parameters in terms of the values that they can take, and this prevents the model from spiking. But of course, this is very input specific, obviously, because if the input is too volatile or insufficient, then you will have odd predictions from the model. But essentially, this model is regularized through its input, which determines the dynamics of these states, plus the parametrization, the parameters that determine the dynamics. Having said that, there's also a class of models that propose that have a autoregressive component or a mean reverting component, right, which are sort of like forgetting models. So you have kind of a decay, a change in the prediction at the next level that can be constant, or it can be or you can, one variant is that you can propose that this expectation about the association or the volatility drifts towards a certain equilibrium point. So drifts away from the prior to another equilibrium point, and that allows you to regularize even further. And the idea there is that it assumes that over time, or in the absence of input, agents will revert to their prior beliefs. So it's like a forgetting type of autoregressive model, and it's true that these models, this process is sometimes necessary for making sure that the model predictions do not reach some instability.
Right. Okay. So I think that was my other question. So that would be like an intrinsic tendency to revert back to some default strategy, some default prior, without, and that has some time scale, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and that would make the whole, mathematically, this would turn into like an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. It'd be like
exactly.
Drift back.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another question, but I'll let other people go first. Thank you.
So I would like to just connect with what just Andrea raised. Just a very quick consideration, because I might have lost it. So you said that the best model right now among all that you tried was this 3-level hierarchical Gaussian model with arbitration, right?
Yeah.
I am not sure how I can, maybe you can give me the gist, how I can see arbitration in relation to the prior, and how this prior essentially plays a role in what I would argue is the perceptual bias.
Yeah.
So basically at the end, when you show the early onset of the psychosis, right, I would argue that the perceptual bias there becomes a predominant component in later development of the psychosis itself. So why is this model, where this information enters in the model, and how the prior and the perceptual bias emerge out of this model?
Yeah. Yes. So basically, I have the equations. It's too bad we don't have a blackboard to write this down, but basically the idea here is that ultimately the probability of the outcome given the input is a weighted sum. So arbitration is essentially the weighting between the social component and the non-social component. It's a weighted sum. Now, at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have the probability of correct advice or probability of red and green. Now, to compute this weighted sum, we argue that it's not enough to just include that inferred probability of each information source, but we weight that by a precision ratio. So you can think of it as a precision weighted sum. And this precision is the precision of the for instance, when we weight the advice, it's the precision of the advice divided by the sum of the two precision, the precision of the advice and the precision of the card. And the other ratio that we weigh the card with is the precision of the card over the sum of the two precisions. Now we can introduce a bias there, which we, in our paper, we call the social bias, which is a parameter that is multiplied with the precision of the advice. It's this kind of extra weighting of that advice precision. Now, in the very first trial, before people have observed the input, you have the prior of the precision and the prior of the prediction that is used to compute this integrated sum. This is the expectation, the agent's expectation of the state of the world before any input is observed. So now in the HGF, you can fix these priors. You can just say, I assume people are rational and they should expect things with a 50-50 probability because they don't have any access to the input. However, it is also possible that you can estimate these initial values, these priors, from the data, from the decisions. And this becomes particularly relevant for psychiatry applications if you assume that people with paranoid beliefs start from a different point, have an offset. So their first prior is at a different level. Now, in the generative model, you have to write down basically for each of these parameters, you have a prior mean and a prior distribution. So based on previous experiments or existing, theories, you can prescribe a functional form and a set of prior means and variances for each of these parameters, the ones that impact the volatility or the association strength, but also for these initial values. And then you can estimate them from the data. Obviously, you have to constrain the model. When it's over parameterized, this is a problem. But basically, in the first initial phase, that's where the prior has the impact, in the first trial before you see the input. But now the next trial's prior is the previous trial prediction. So you carry that through from trial to trial and you update that precision ratio and the prediction about each information source. And that's basically the arbitration, that you have this sum that is weighted by these precision ratios.
Okay, thanks. The reference that you said is your paper in eLife 2020 or the SCAN paper?
The 2020 eLife paper.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Any further question? Alexandra, I think you had another question you wanted to.
Yeah, I can ask very quickly. I was wondering, in terms of the findings of your very first model that you showed, the very first experiment, well, you were showing that there were players and they had to make the right decisions based on the advices they were given and the environmental cues. Yeah. I was wondering what was the main finding of this model, this experiment. I didn't quite understood that. I didn't quite understand that part. I understood that you said that you found that the players were affected both by environmental cues and the advice that they were given. Well, that part is sort of expected, but I was wondering, were you able to sort of quantify to what extent they were affected by each of these two aspects, or there was something else that I missed?
Yeah, exactly. So the first experiment allowed us to validate the model. So
I see.
assess its construct, validity, and predictability. So we could estimate for each subject parameters that describe how they were learning. So I mean here the player, each player. And what we were able to find is that the parameters of the players describing the learning process could predict the type of advisor that they were paired with. So advisors that were fair were paired with players that interacted with fair advisors tended to weight the advice overwhelmingly over the pie chart. They also tended to experience the environment as more stable, and I think that's it. Those two parameters. Whereas if we were players that had that experienced the environment as very volatile and downweighted the advice, were paired with what we call kind of Machiavellian advisors. So advisors that were kind of at the opposite end in terms of strategy. They were more likely to mislead than help in the task, in spite of the incentive structure. And the other thing we did is that we had a non-social component of the task because we wanted to figure out, is it something special about this interaction? So we took intentionality away from the advisor by blindfolding the advisor and having them pick out advice from a deck of cards. So they had no control over the advice that they were given. And we found that the model that assumed that had a social intentional agent paired with the player was a model that incorporated volatility into the learning process and this mapping between beliefs and decisions. So it also kind of allowed us not only to validate the model, but to be able to ascertain whether there was something distinct about this social interaction when there's an intentional advice.
Yeah, I appreciate the experiment a lot more now. Thank you. And one last thing, these models are very interesting and one can think of many applications other than psychosis. Have you ever thought about using them to predict successful decision-making even in healthy populations? That could have applications in gambling, investments, stock market, and all this sort of thing. So do you think that these models could have application in these scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they are very useful at capturing variation of human behavior. Also, the effect of the impact of reward on how people compute uncertainty, or how they estimate uncertainty at different levels of this hierarchy. And I think that's particularly interesting in the context of gambling, because if you kind of ask people that gamble slot machines, where it's such a it's the process where uncertainty cannot be reduced by learning, because there is no learning, trial by trial learning involved. But people who gamble talk about hot and cool machines, that, oh, you should play this machine because it's very hot. What is it about this stochasticity of that context that leads people to become very addicted in playing that process? So, and one of my colleagues at Translation Neuromodeling Unit looked into this, and it has to do with this type of irreducible uncertainty that can be predicted by the model. So it's very interesting, the applications in that domain as well.
Thanks.
Andrea?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or did you say Andre or Andrea?
Yeah, no.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to throw in one last question here. I'm just wondering if you can comment on how smooth things vary in these models of yours as you change parameters. And are there any circumstances where you see kind of sharp transitions in behavior or something? To me, it seems the structure is quite smooth, but I know there's some experiments, on mice, I think, where they're playing some game and, they're winning. They're getting a lot of juice, but then they turn the knob and they make the task more difficult. And at some point, the mouse just reverts to a completely different strategy, right? Its beliefs no longer work. And you'd see kind of this transition, and they go, for example, to a random strategy rather than a learning-based strategy. So if there's any kind of transitions that happen in these models, this might be seen when you do that light in the room experiment by reducing, the amplitude of the light or something, or like, do things just very smoothly, or are there sharp transitions?
Yeah, so that's I think one maybe caveat of the model, that by its nature the transitions tend to be quite smooth by this filter process. I just show you, if you look at the trajectories of a subject, for example, just show that quickly. Yeah. So yeah, what you tend to see is sort of it gets smoother and smoother as you go kind of up this hierarchy of states, and so it's difficult to capture change points. The best you can do, basically, or what we've done so far in our experiments, is to see this jump in the clinical high risk. So this is the predicted environmental volatility by phase, that once you reverse, once you introduce the first reversal, you see that this volatility estimation increases, and that has to do with one of the parameters of the model that explains this jump. But this is kind of the most you would get in this framework, I would say. But one way that you could do that is through, you could think of it as a kind of a model comparison. So you can think of the agent as having kind of two competing models, a hierarchical one, like the one that wins in our tasks, and a reduced one that assumes, let's say, no volatility. And you can think of a phase, you can think of the process as in each phase, there is a dominant model. And essentially that has to do with uncertainty. So if your model of the world does not help the organism get to maximize reward, maximize utility, then you can think of it as reverting to the reduced model. So you can think of it as a kind of a model comparison setting, and you could capture this extreme switches in the strategy that way. But when it comes to the volatility here, it would be rather smooth as opposed to rapid. We've seen rapid switches, but they've often reflected some sort of problem in the model inversion. So we've seen kind of especially in applications to patient populations, we've seen situations where, let's say, a patient forgets about the association strength, or just starts using a completely different strategy halfway through the experiment, and then you see that the model basically just cuts out and cannot really fit behavior anymore in
the behavior has changed. Yeah.
Exactly, it has changed. It's become so stochastic that the model parameters cannot explain it. At least the learning process cannot explain the behavior, and that's often that becomes an issue because the model gives you an estimation, but it's not the right one, since it doesn't reflect. It tries to explain this abnormal behavior through extreme parameter estimates.
Right. Okay, thanks. I don't think twice when I go to the bank now with the advisors, should get these, you should be able to see epiphanies and like, hey, this person is not working for me anymore, right? You see that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it also has to do with what is interesting is also how that relates to people's perception of reliability. So so trust is all about how reliable you think someone is. So if people experience or come in with priors about volatility or priors like that, then that will actually predict how they trust others. And yeah, it's now in the media that's very prominent with all the conspiracy theories and all this all these things. So a colleague actually a collaborator, Phil Corlett, has applied this model to actually model delusions following the whole mask wearing mandates, the various mask wearing mandates in the US. So they did these large studies using the mechanical Turk, so administering these types of probabilistic learning tasks to a large group of subjects and capturing sort of these delusional beliefs via these parameters of the model, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Perfect. Andreea, actually, I have one question. So would you please back to the part of the presentation when you showed the, the performance of different, these models in, you calculate. Yes, exactly. So here, kind of from modeling perspective. So when you compare, okay, so for instance, let's say in M6 or M7, okay, so one of the probably criteria that the tree-level model is better can be because of the structure, which is right. I mean that the structure it is framed, it results in a better kind of prediction or less error. But in terms of the complexity of the system, for instance, if you add, I don't know, somehow extra parameters in the other models, how do you think that they can be better and provide better prediction? And especially the reason I'm asking this is not just about the modeling. So I want to connect this question to the cognitive map or cognitive network that you showed. Yeah. I was wondered if you, for instance, pick another kind of a model, then in that cognitive network, how significant that network will change, or our interpretation of that network will change.
Yeah. So first, when to compare models, we've used the estimation of the free energy that takes into account the accuracy and complexity of the model. So it penalizes models that have too many parameters that are in a sense that are redundant or are not explaining some unique aspect of the data. So this is how we deal with this question of complexity across models. Now, what you see here in this graph, so the reason that some models look very similar to each other low, basically, is that it just reflects the prior. So the prior is that, all models are equally likely. And then the posterior, you see that there is kind of two more dominant models, M1 and M7, and that's most subjects are explained by model 1, but some subjects will also be explained by model 7. But if you kind of take this question of how does the cognitive network change based on the model that explains behavior, the assumption is that the cognitive network is very model specific. So I just go back to that. So the model, so the cognitive network that we propose about how the input is used to update the prediction, and how the prediction error feeds into that, and how the prediction error is used to update the prediction about the tendency, and so on and so forth, is really dependent on the model that you found to best explain behavior. So if there is a different computational mechanism at play, then you would assume a different cognitive network to explain that behavior. What you can do actually with statistical parametric mapping, and this is toolbox that was added by one of John Dylan Haynes' former postdocs. Joch is the last name, I believe. You can also use this model selection procedure at the level of the GLMs. So basically, you could investigate whether your how well your expected modeled trajectories explain activity in particular parts of the brain, with the assumption that it might be that certain parts of the brain are using a different model of learning, maybe reduced versions, such as, let's say, the striatum, the ventral striatum nucleus accumbens is operating under an RL type of model, whereas, let's say, the dorsal ACC is operating under a hierarchical model. So I think that's a reasonable research question, and in principle, it could be tested through model selection procedures.
Okay, great. And I have one last question. I know it's 12 and you're tired now. So my last question is about more, you showed this, kind of very consistent research from, 2012, 2013, 2014 now, and it was really great. Really great. And I see you also mentioned about the clinical, implications from kind of multi-scale brain modeling, and probably, with respect to new devices that, can do the simulation recording from different locations in the brain. Mm-hmm. What do you see the next modeling steps? I mean, what will you do in, let's say, 2-3 years to 5 years for the modeling perspective, multi-scale brain? What's the next step in your lab?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I think, for example, if we find that an aspect of this network explains this sort of transition to psychosis. So, for example, the impact of that lower level precision weighted prediction error on predictions about, let's say, advisor fidelity in that case. If this explains that aspect of maladaptive behavior, one can first of all think about how do we change that, how we change behavior through, for example, through training. So one aspect of this model that's very nice is that it can be used to help us in task design. So, for instance, based on subjects' parameters, you could design the task in such a way as to increase or decrease volatility, or to reduce the impact of biases or priors. So you can adapt the design of the task, the probabilistic learning aspect of the task, given the person's performance. So we could look at, how can we change that, let's say, effective connectivity, that effect of that prediction error on higher level predictions. You can do the same through pharmacological validation studies, and this is something that we're currently analyzing, the impact of dopamine agonists and antagonists on this learning process and on connectivity. But you can also think about stimulation, for example. So if you find that there is sort of a node in the network that explains, let's say, rigid behavior, or explains reductions in learning rate, in other words, explains reductions in that parameter omega, for example, of the model, you can test whether, for example, brain stimulation has a causal impact on the learning process as expressed by changes in these parameter estimates. So you could use these parameter estimates as a way of tracking learning fingerprints within subject over time and assessing the impact of interventions.
Yeah, this is just great. Francis has probably a final question quickly.
Yeah, sorry, I know you must be tired, and thank you for staying. Yeah, I thought it was a fantastic talk, but I was really interested about the neuromodulatory linkage that you sort of referred to, and you just mentioned it right now. And so I guess looking to the future, sort of like what Milad was referring to, is, do you ever imagine that you'd be able to sort of, so they can target maybe certain regions from your model, and do you think you could get it, could you imagine get it down to microcircuit importance in different aspects, so, a certain part, like, to say hippocampus, because, something about that, a certain specific neuromodulation going on, do you imagine ever being able to link down to that level from your types of models, or not? Was that?
I think it would certainly be possible. I think the question of whether this type of hierarchical Gaussian filtering could represent changes in local changes in excitatory or inhibitory potentials. I think it's a really valid question. So far, we've looked at it, indirectly by using sort of GLM approach in fMRI, but the next step is to write down a neural circuit model that could be performing these functions. So you have a population of neurons that are kind of volatility tracking neurons that affect the precision or the synaptic gain of another population of neurons that are tracking the association strength and so on. So I think it would definitely be a huge progress to kind of relate that to neural processing, more specifically, to relate this formalism, and that would generate testable hypotheses. I think that so far we haven't been able to address, looking at this more correlational approach using the general linear model.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot, Andreea, again. It was really a great talk and a lot of learning, at least for myself. And yeah, thanks a lot for your time and for accepting our invitation. Francis,
Thank
do you
you
have
very
anything?
much.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe, everyone, and happy holidays.
Thank you, Andreea. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.